You're listening to a Hebrew in Israel podcast with Yoel Halevi, exploring the language, culture, and history of the Bible. For more information, visit us at HebrewInIsrael.net.
Shalom everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Hebrew in Israel Haftarah series. I'm your host, Yoel Halevi. I want to thank you for joining me again, and this week we are in the Haftarah Tetzaveh. Again, this year I'm recording when there, in at least the rabbinic calendar, there is an additional month. We don't know yet what's actually going to happen as I record these recordings. I don't know yet what's going to happen with the year based on the barley and the Aviv barley, and therefore I'm anyhow going to be recording because, there are going to be years where these recordings are going to be important, at least for the cycle reading of the rabbinic, and also eventually if, say for example, we don't add a month in the Aviv barley calendar, then at least we'll have for other years as well. And for those wondering, for those maybe are new to this principle, because these things do come up, it is important, at least for now. It's an opportunity to bring this up, although I've spoken about this multiple times. The biblical calendar is an agricultural calendar, which means at least parts of it are agricultural calendar, and there's some really interesting research that I've been studying lately about the subject. And an agricultural calendar means that you're dealing with a solar calendar. However, because we also use a 12-month cycle system, it is a lunisolar calendar and not just lunar or just solar. It's both, and there's no other way to actually present this type of calendar. And any attempts to try to take the calendar outside of this structure is folly, because it doesn't work with anything we know about what was actually going on in the region. A lunisolar calendar was very, very common, though there were cultures who focused more on one thing over the other. For example, in Egypt, they had a lunar calendar, but the solar part was very, very central in other parts of the different kingdoms that existed, and so on. But in the region of the land of Israel, as far as we know, from what we can deduce from the biblical text, from what we know from other cultures which surrounded us, it's very clear it was a lunisolar calendar. I've seen people overemphasize the moon, maybe because people might be misunderstanding some of the functions and so on. I actually made a comment about this, and I had several people say, "Well, what you're saying solar? What about the moon?" I said, of course, the moon is there. So it's very important for me to point out that you need to be very, very careful how you read certain posts. Sometimes I try to word my posts to the best of my ability to make sure it's clear what I mean. Sometimes things are misunderstood. It happens with even if someone is very, very clear. Even though I'm very aware of the fact that I'm not 100% clear, and I have to rework sometimes things that I write. It's normal. It happens. But on this specific post, I was very, very, very clear. And it's very important to understand that the lunar-solar system is very, very clear in the Bible. People who want to do only lunar are going to deal with a calendar that drags around throughout the entire year. You eventually end up celebrating things in different times of the seasons, because there's misreadings of Genesis 1. There's a lot of attempts to try to read different texts to try to prove one calendar over the other. It's actually a very, very complicated subject. I've actually been studying the subject of calendars under a very specific person who is considered to be a world-renowned expert in the subject. And we're currently discussing this. He's slowly entering me into this discussion because he's dedicated the last 20-odd years of his academic career. I think his academic career is over 30 years, but his academic career in the last, at least, I want to say 10 to 15 years, maybe even more. I never actually asked him exactly how long he's been working on this type of material. He's very, very well known in this field, and he's slowly getting me into this subject, giving me different articles to read, different books to read. It's a very, very complicated subject, and in truth, a lot of people have been trying to explain how the calendar exactly works. It's way more complicated than most people understand. Not just the side of, understanding how to exactly calculate different things. I'm not talking about the calculations. Calculations are another thing. They're not simple. However, what I'm actually mostly talking about is the fact that we actually have in the Bible several calendars which are coexisting side by side, and I think that people sometimes misinterpret what these different calendars are doing, causing a lot of discrepancies in how people understand the subject. So hopefully, by the end of the process, this is going to be a process of at least, right now, based on about 10-month tutoring that I'm going to undergo from him. He's already started me off with multiple papers and books, and we'll see how it develops from there. But I stressed with him that I actually want to be trained by him specifically about calendars, because the subject really does interest me, and hopefully by the end of the process I'll have a much broader understanding of calendars and different questions that exist about calendars. But I do have to admit that when people only focus on one element in the calendar and overemphasize that one specific element over another, we kind of get into a place where arguments develop over things that unfortunately I'm not 100% sure that certain people always fully understand, but it's understandable how people come to certain conclusions because it actually is pretty complicated. It is way more complicated than I anticipated, because you think, oh, just look up to the moon, see the moon, celebrate the new month, and so on. It's a bit more complicated than that. Firecrackers, don't worry about that noise. One of the problems is that nowadays here in Israel, everyone just starts everything too early, because in Purim, people make noise when they mention the name of Haman. People use firecrackers sometimes to make that noise. It's not really part of the tradition. It's something that started, I don't know, in the last 30 years, I want to say. So unfortunately, if you hear those noises, it's just firecrackers. There's a bunch of kids here scaring people, unfortunately. But in any case, the subject here of the calendar is very, very complicated. There are different aspects about understanding the calendar, and hopefully by the end of it all, I'll be able to at least have a much better grasp of the whole subject. But going back to the question, what's going on here, we can't know, because I get asked this question over and over again every year. We can't know when exactly the calendar, if we're going to add, how the calendar is going to work, if we're going to add a month or not. Right now, it's been pretty rainy here in Israel, even though the past week, from the week of this recording, it's been pretty sunny here. Temperatures went up a little bit, but the winter is supposed to come back. The nights are very cold, even in the area I live in, which the temperatures are usually a bit higher. And we might still have many systems, God willing, many other rain systems come in, which means things will mature a lot later in time. Chances are, we haven't added a leap year in a while. There's a very high possibility that there will be something, but again, I stress, we don't know. So for everyone wondering this question, and especially because this recording specifically comes out in the beginning of the 12th month, people are going to ask questions. Obviously, there are people who say, well, show me where there's a 13th month in the Bible. And my response to that is, the Bible doesn't tell us everything. It's very important to understand this. And we actually are going to point out, for example, something that's not mentioned in our reading today, something that you would think, hey, look, I want to know how this is supposed to be constructed. And we're not told. With all the details that we have, we're not told anything. And I'm going to show it to you in this specific reading. And that's the thing. The Bible also assumes you know certain things. So our reading specifically is for this. This will be the reading of Tetzaveh, Yechezqel, Ezekiel 34:10 to 34:27, only 17 verses. However, these 17 verses strongly connect to the reading of Tetzaveh and the description of the altar. If we think about the construction of the altar as described in the Torah, it's very, very detailed, even though there are some pieces which you can debate a little bit what these pieces are. The general idea of what the altar is supposed to be like is pretty clear, because we actually have examples of altars from the ancient Near East, even portable altars and so on. Small altars, I've actually seen models of very, very small altars. For example, in my university, the University of Haifa, we have a museum there, and the museum has very, very small altars. They're tiny, tiny little house items that people used to have, and used to burn incense on these things, which was a very, very common practice. I've actually been asked before about this, and the answer is it seems to be that people used to do house ceremonies as well, even amongst the Israelites, and this was not burning the incense of the temple. This was sometimes burning myrrh or some kind of combination of incense that people used. And there's actually a really interesting verse in Isaiah where it says, "V'chol makom muqdash lishmi," in every place there is incense being burnt and sanctified for me. Seems to be that there was some kind of a practice. Nili Vazana, actually, Dr. Nili Vazana, suggested the possibility that this is relating to the area of Syria of today, the Aramean lands. By the way, I actually checked why it's called Syria. Apparently the Greeks, in the mess that they made of names of places, Syria of today is called Syria because of the name Assyria, probably because they kind of confused the Assyrians with the Aramean-speaking peoples. But it doesn't matter. In the area of Syria, Nili Vazana suggested the possibility that there might have been a cult of the God of Israel there, which means that there were people who served the God of Israel in that area. And that's why that verse says that. And she links it to Naaman, the story in 2 Kings with Elisha. Naaman, the warlord, the war minister of the Aramean armies, the general who became a leper. He ends up being cured by Elisha, and he goes back to his house with donkey loads of earth to make an altar. So there we have a reference to making an altar from earth. And that really does connect us to previous readings, specifically Yitro, where it says, if you make an altar for me, you'll make it out of earth. However, if you make an altar out of stone, it has to be unhewn stone. So this is a really interesting thing. The stone altar is the second option out of the two. The first altar is actually supposed to be made out of earth. Now, that's really, really, really interesting. And the problem is that, again, which one is it supposed to be? Because when we think about altars in the ancient world, we always think about these stone altars. But then we get a description in Exodus 20 where it says, you make Mizbach Adama, an earthen altar. So this takes us back to the altar described in our reading in the Parashat Tetzaveh, where we actually have an altar. And I actually want to confirm it's actually in Tetzaveh, because I sometimes confuse things. Yes, as I suspected. I confused two parashot. We're actually talking about in Parashat Truma, which raises some of the questions of why we read this specific segment from Ezekiel. And this was it actually bothered me as I was preparing this. However, what's very interesting, the end of Truma is the description, or towards the end of Truma is the description of the altar. And then we have Parashat Tetzaveh. Now, Parashat Tetzaveh specifically, the reason we have this connection to Parashat Tetzaveh is because of what happens in chapter 29, where we have a description of what to do when we dedicate the altar, an act that's repeated in Parashat in the book of Vayikra, in the book of Leviticus. But the connection here is very, very, very important, because what we're actually going to be reading, and this is what we're reading from Yechezqel, is a description of the altar there, and the ceremony that has to be done on the dedication of the altar. Now, basically, what we have here in the description of the altar in the book of Exodus is an altar that's actually made from wooden planks, wooden plates, covered with copper or bronze. It depends, because really we're talking about different processes, and because this is not supposed to be a weapon, this actually might be copper and not necessarily bronze. For those who don't know the difference, bronze is a material that's produced through a process of adding tin to the copper and causing it to turn to bronze, which is a harder form of metal. And for non-weapon use, you don't necessarily have to have something that hard. Weapons or farm tools and so on. But if you're using it for example, you want to make a vessel for service, the copper is cleaner. It's a cleaner material. The problem is that the Hebrew word for copper and bronze is the exact same word, nechoshet. Okay, later on in modern Hebrew, we use the term bronza, which is borrowed from European languages to describe, for example, the Bronze Age, or the materials that people use. But when we refer to nechoshet, plainly nechoshet in Hebrew, we're actually just talking about copper. So it's not very clear which one we're talking about here, but it's quite possible that we're talking about copper and not bronze, because copper is a finer material. However, for example, when it comes to the two pillars that King Solomon had, because they were of a very great weight, things that had to carry great weights, like for example the Sea of Solomon, the Great Basin which sat on the 12 oxen, that actually might have been bronze because of the weight, so it has to be a lot stronger. It's a very, very good question. Not very clear, but I have a suspicion this is actually made out of copper. And because of this connection of the altar to the ceremony itself, Ezekiel basically describes an altar together with the ceremony, and that's why I was a little bit off here with the parashot. However, it's also important to remember that these parashot are sometimes read together, side by side, in years where we don't add a leap year, so these sometimes get a little bit confused, but at the end of the day, at least I've clarified that. But what's very interesting here is that we have a very, very detailed description of the altar, and it actually makes a really interesting statement. And it says, in Exodus 27, verse 8, it says, Nevuv luchot ta'aseh oto. Nevuv luchot, the word nevuv usually refers to the idea of something which is hollow. And the understanding is that the altar itself was actually hollowed from the inside, which means that we actually have a box that you fill up with something inside that. That actually might be the reference to the earthen altar. So what's the idea of making a stone altar? Maybe the idea of making a stone altar is when you make an altar that's not in the temple itself. And that takes us, for example, to the site of Mount Eval, which was excavated by the late Adam Ziltal, Dr. Adam Ziltal, who dug there, and he found what he understood was an altar. I think he's right, and it has nothing to do with me being it's not just because I'm a man of faith. It's also an issue of just, look, I'm looking at what the excavation produced, and a lot of the attempts to try to argue with something else is kind of folly. So I recommend this. If you want to hear about the story of the altar, you can actually go to the podcast that deals with this subject. But very briefly, what they discovered there was a fieldstone altar, which means that someone actually went around and picked up rocks from the area and basically built up an altar. And if there was ever any mortar there, it's all gone. But the reason we know this is an altar, and one of the reasons I think it's very clear to me it's an altar, first of all, because they found ashes inside. And by the way, this altar, just to connect it to the brazen altar, actually had an open space inside as well. Now, that open space was filled with dirt, but also with a lot of ashes and bones. So there's a question there, did they actually produce like a mound of earth or something that was used as a base for the altar, and then from there build it up? Now, we do know that there was some kind of, again, there's a question, but it seems to be that there was some kind of a dedication ceremony there, because they found some kind of a stone as a starter for the altar, which seems to have some kind of burning signs on it, if I remember correctly. You can actually read Adam Ziltal's book about the subject. Was translated to English, if I'm not mistaken. And then they started building up on that, and you can see the ramps, you can see everything. They reconstructed the altar. Some people try to argue it's some kind of a watchtower. I heavily doubt it. There's very strong signs there of ritual and everything. But what's very interesting, that altar actually has some earth in it as well, but mostly ashes and so on. So it's possible that the difference between the two references of the verses here is when we go back to Exodus 20, the two references here of an earthen altar versus a stone altar has to do with the conditions that you're specifically in. Now, if we go ahead into Solomon's temple, we don't really have a clear specification of what this altar was like, because we don't really have a description. What we do have is, if you go into 2 Kings, I think it's chapter 16. I will confirm in a second. Because it's a chapter, actually, I did a study on this chapter, wrote a big paper that was published, but only in Hebrew. But I just keep on forgetting which chapter it is exactly. Yes, chapter 16, I was right, just to confirm. we actually have a description there of King Achaz and King Achaz. This is the only chapter about King Achaz. And it was a very tricky paper to write on because unlike other stories of other kings, we don't have a lot of data to work on. I had to reconstruct a lot of the history of what was going on there. And one of the things that's really interesting is it says that he went up to Damascus and he sees an altar. Then he's usually condemned for this, even though there's quite a bit of evidence to actually show that this was not what it seems to be. King Achaz wasn't as wicked as it seems. He probably want to innovate the temple, but he innovated the wrong way, where he brought in something from Damascus, and he should have maybe just renovated the temple based on other elements. But one of the things he does is he brings in a different altar, and he actually constructs the altar, and he gives it to Uriah. Now, Uriah specifically is referred to in the book of Isaiah as a loyal witness to Isaiah, to Yeshayahu, so, which raises with me questions of, would Uriah, who's a loyal servant, a loyal witness, be someone who would give hand to something so heinous and wicked? And I basically come to the conclusion that there's a lot more hiding behind the story, and that's really what the paper is about. But the thing that comes up from this entire discussion is the fact that he gives Uriah the schematics. And the schematics here, and again, I'm leading this basically into what we're going to be reading in Ezekiel. He gives him schematics, which means that there are rules. There are rules and regulations of how you do things. And I'm going to explain about the background of these rules and regulations in a moment. But one of the things that happens there is he tells him to move Solomon's altar and build this new altar in that in the location of the original altar. And what's interesting is suddenly we discover what this altar is made from. And he says to him in 2 Kings, chapter 16, verse 14, "V'et hamizbach hanechoshet." And there might be a bit of a grammatical issue here, but the copper altar, asher lifnei Adonai, which was before the Lord, ve'akrev me'et penei habayit, he drew it near, or actually he took it away from the entrance to the house, miben hamizbach umben beit Adonai, from between the house of the altar and the house of the Lord, and he placed it on the side of the altar to the north. What it actually means is that he removed the altar of Solomon, moved it northwards, and actually placed this new altar in front of the house where the original altar was. Now, this actually gives us an indication that King Solomon's altar was a portable one, just like the one in the tabernacle. So, this raises a lot of interesting questions in regards to what is supposed to be in the temple to be. Because one of the questions that's raised is, what exactly is the temple that Ezekiel describes? And actually in a discussion that I had, a very brief discussion that I had about Ezekiel and overall, and the last chapters of Ezekiel, and I haven't really gone around to really look at the entire thing, but I also know that Dr. Rimon Kasher has research on this, and I plan to eventually get into it. But one of the questions that we have is, what exactly is the temple that Ezekiel is describing? And one of the things that my professor described to me, Dr. Lior Goldman, is that there's a chance that he's actually describing a lot of things about a lot of elements which are actually taken from Solomon's temple, if not actually the first temple being re-described to us at its last stages, where it was at its peak of construction. But obviously there's a problem with this argument, because we have a description of a temple now that's much, much bigger. There are some descriptions here which I am not sure can be consistent with the first temple, but there is a chance that there are many, many elements which are still taken from the first temple. In the second temple, what they did is they actually built a stone altar, which raises a lot of questions, because what we see is that they're told to build an altar made out of copper, wood with copper. Seems to be that Solomon repeats this idea. And then we actually have a change during the second temple into a stone altar. This is why I am always very, very iffy about the second temple. There are things which are done there which I have great difficulty with. However, it is possible, by the way, they built a stone altar because they didn't have enough metal to produce a large copper altar And the maintenance of such an altar is a lot of work. So they went for the second option, even though probably the original point or the original altar was supposed to be an altar made out of wood and copper. There have been studies that I've seen. I think Osishkin, for example, wrote about this, where he goes into the direction of arguing that the Temple of Solomon is really a larger scale tabernacle. Even though there's stone masonry there and so on, the structure itself is supposed to be a box inside a box, where the inner box is actually made out of wood and gold, which is the tabernacle, and then around it there's a stone structure that's supposed to basically protect it. But the original structure was actually mostly wood inside, which actually fits quite well into the description that we have of Solomon's temple. A lot of use of wood there, and therefore the vessels themselves were supposed to be a continuation of Moses's structure, which means that the altar itself was also made out of copper with earth and maybe some stone, but mostly earth inside. And Achaz, maybe this is one of the accusations, Achaz builds a stone altar, and that's really the problem with what he does, that he changes the construction of the temple in such a degree where he's moved away from the original plan of the temple, which uses a copper altar, and he moves to a stone altar, and that's why he's criticized for it. We never actually discover what happens with this altar. It's quite possible this altar was dismantled by Tzidkiyahu or by Josiah. A lot of questions about this. We never actually hear again about this altar, so there's a lot of stuff that we just don't know what happened there. There's a lot of pieces which are missing. And we actually have the same problem with the description in Ezekiel, because Ezekiel describes an altar, and he also describes a ceremony. The ceremony part is actually less complicated. It's the altar itself that he's describing, which is very unusual, because it's not made from one piece or, say, three pieces, as most of us understand, where there's a base, a central box, and then a top part. Most drawings that you would see of the brazen altar would show you usually like a base and a top box, or maybe they try to move some of the elements of the second temple altar into this altar, into the brazen altar or the copper altar. They try to make a base with a box and a third box on top. Here, Ezekiel clearly describes 4 boxes, one on top of the other, but he doesn't tell us what it's made from. He leaves that completely in the open. But before we go into the verses, there's one more thing I wanted to talk about, and that's the issue of divine temples. What's very, very important here is to understand that Moses and Ezekiel, Moshe and Yechezqel, are comparable to one another because they both receive visions of the temple. Now, Ezekiel was a Cohen, but still from the tribe of Levi. Still, Cohens are supposed to be from the tribe of Levi. And they're both prophets. They both receive visions. They both have to write down or use depictions of drawings or models. We're not 100% sure exactly how it was done, but they're both shown things. They're supposed to transmit this information to the people because they're supposed to construct it based on this vision. But this connection goes even beyond that, because in the description itself of the actions of the dedication of the altar, it actually talks to Ezekiel in the first person, which sounds as if he's supposed to do the ceremony, which is really, really interesting, because that's exactly what Moses does. Moses, in description of the dedication in chapter 29, and then later on in Leviticus, I think it's Leviticus 8, we actually have either 6 or 8, I don't remember right now. We have a very, very clear depiction that Moses functioned, even though it was a Levite, Moses functioned as a Kohen during that period of the dedication of the temple. They both have a 7-day dedication. On the 8th day, everyone starts sacrificing everything else. And we just basically have a functioning temple. So there's interesting lines here that connect Ezekiel to Moses. And the process here is also very, very complicated, because they take up large segments of the books. The description of the tabernacle is doubled. Now, there's a reason it's doubled, because that's already happened. There's a tendency in the Bible to sometimes say someone was commanded to do something, and it says, and he did so. With Moses, we even have a very massive description of not only that he did so, we have a duplicate of the description again a few chapters down the road after Kitisa. And We even have in Yechezqel, we have Yechezqel Pekudei, we get numbers and so on and so forth. That's because it was fulfilled. In Ezekiel, we only have a description of this, and this has to be done, and this has to be done, and this has to be done, and it's all about in the future. So we never really get a description of now it's ending, now it's been done, and so on. A very interesting thing, just as a last tidbit, there actually is a document known as Pseudo Ezekiel, and it's also known as parts of it known as also as Pseudo as the Apocryphon of Jeremiah C. These are Dead Sea Scrolls, and there we actually have a rewriting of the vision in Ezekiel 37 where it describes the dry bones, but there it's describing as if it's already happened, and it was so, and it was so. It actually repeats the idea, and it was so 3 times. And there the feeling of the writer is that the resurrection of Israel has already happened, because Ezekiel 37 is not really about the resurrection of the dead. That's a very complicated subject to discuss. Has to do a lot with what was going on in the Second Temple and so on. But Ezekiel 37 actually cuts short the description of the bones and goes straight into the actual interpretation of the metaphor there, which is the idea of the rising of Israel back as a nation. But what's very, very interesting is that there the writer feels, look, this has already happened. Because look, we're back in our land, we're doing something here. There's something's not 100% right. So we do actually have a really interesting attitude here towards the descriptions of Ezekiel, and this is why I'm allowing myself to actually say Ezekiel doesn't have a duplicate of what was being described, because Ezekiel never really happened. When they built the Second Temple, they only imitated some things from the description Ezekiel had, and the rest of it was left out. So now that we go into the text, and again, this is a very, very short reading, but we go into the text. He says to him, "Ata ven Adam," and you, son of man. Ezekiel is always referred to as son of man because of the vision he has in the beginning and in chapter 10. It says, "Haged et bet Yisrael et habayit." Tell the children of the house of Israel, the house. Describe to them the house. "V'kalmu me'avonotehem u'madedut et tochnit." And they will be ashamed of their iniquities, and they will measure the plan. There's actually, for those who are interested in temple studies, I actually have a friend, which I've never actually met face to face, but is a good friend of other friends, called Joseph Good, and he's spent a lot of years studying this subject of the temple. And so if you were looking for something in English, this is a shout out to Joseph Good. He may know about this, he may not know about this, but a shout out to him anyhow, because he's really dedicated himself to this subject, and I have some really good friends who studied from him. And from what I can tell, he did a pretty good job on the subject, even though from my perspective, the way I perceive things, I would completely disagree with him on some things, not on everything. But the reason he comes to mind is because I think he came out with a book called Measure the Plan. So it just came to mind. So this is an interesting book that you might want to read in English. And he says, "Ve'im nichlemu mikol asher asu," and if they will be ashamed of all that they have done. So there's a question here. Is it a reference to what we have in verse 10, or is it more playing off of the word v'kalmu in verse 10? What he's really saying is something else. And this is a word play, and in truth what he's actually saying, if they were embarrassed or unclear from all that they have done, so tzurat habayit v'tchunato, the shape of the house and its plan. So tchuna and tuchnit is again playing with the words here. Umotza'av umova'av v'chol tzurato. So its exits and its entries, basically all its gates and pathways and so on, and all its shape. Ve'et kol chukotav v'chol tzurotav v'chol torotav, and all its laws and shapes and instructions. Hoda otam uchtov le'enehem. Let them know and write before their eyes. Ve'ishmeru et kol tzurato ve'et kol chukotav v'asu otam. And they will guard all its shape and all its commandment, or its laws or commandments, and they will do them. Now, this statement here is a little bit weird, but there's actually something very important to state here about this. There's a reason that immediately after the Ten Commandments we have a description of an altar. Because the idea of building temples was a divine decree in the ancient world. Kings would have dreams and prophecies and be told to build this and build that. Ramses III falls asleep next to the Sphinx, and there's actually an inscription. We know about this because he actually left an inscription behind him. Well, actually not behind him, but inscription at the foot of the Sphinx where he describes this, where he had a dream, and where the god shows up and tells him to build a temple. We also have the same thing with Nebunaid, who was the one who brought the demise of Babylon, and he actually dedicated his life to a different god, and not the original god of the Babylonians. He actually dedicated himself to the god of the moon, called Sin. And but a lot of the stories that we have of temple building actually come from dreams and stuff like that. So what we actually have here is that guarding the structure of the temple, this is not by chance, because there's an issue here of obedience to God. There's an issue here of doing God's will, doing God's commandments. So when people say we don't need a temple, with all due respect, I beg to differ. It's actually part of the structure of service of God in overall. And it's a very, very important. This is avodat Elohim. This is the service of Elohim. This is not just, some ritual and this and that. No, these parts are deeply embedded in the structure of any service in the ancient world, and was so central that it was always attributed to the idea of a God appearing and saying, "I want you to do this." And this is where the Torah spends so much time describing the tabernacle. And this is why Ezekiel spends so much time describing his temple. And this is why the book of Kings takes at least 2 chapters describing parts of the temple, and then an 8th chapter, a very, very long 8th chapter, that deals with the dedication of the temple. And it's very, very important to understand that these are not things which are trivial. These are actually very, very important elements of the service of Elohim throughout the Bible. And this is why Yechezqel is actually told to do these different things. But it's connected. Having a temple is not a right, it's a privilege. And this is why he connects the idea of the sins. This is why the temple was destroyed because of sin. But he says the sins themselves cause them, this is the wordplay, the sins cause them to be unable to identify how the structure is supposed to be built, which means the divine knowledge of what's supposed to be done is obscured because of the sins. Now, again, I'm starting to trot a little bit in the territory of sectarian thinking and so on, but at least partially this is true. And this is why he has to make the drawings and show it to them. Also, it's very practical. You have to show them what you mean, because if I just describe things in words, you won't really understand until I make a drawing of it or a model. And then he says to him, so by the way, usually it's understood that the verses 10, this is Ezekiel again, Ezekiel 33, verses 10 to 11. This is usually understood as being an ending to the previous segment of the description of the temple. And it says, Zot Torat Habayit. This is again repeating a bit of the structure of the beginning of the description that we have in chapter 40, verse 1. It kind of repeats itself. So this is kind of like a bridge between the different segments. And he says, Zot Torat Habayit. This is the law of the house. Al Rosh Hahar kol gvulo, on the top of the mountain, all around, Saviv Kodesh Kodeshim, top of the mountain, its borders, all around, Holy of Holies, Hineh Zot Torat Habayit. Behold, this is the laws of the house. These are the laws of the house. And that actually technically ends the segment, this specific segment. Now he starts talking about the altar. Now, what's very interesting, you can actually compare Ezekiel 34 to Exodus 29, and we can actually compare, though we're going to be reading it, you can compare Ezekiel 34, 27 to Leviticus 9. So I was wrong, it wasn't 8, it's 9. 1 to 6 and 24, you can actually read them side by side. And there are a lot of similarities between them, but there's also some differences. So the things which are similar are that it's a 7-day ceremony. You have to sprinkle the blood of an ox. The ox is burnt outside of the temple. In both cases, the instructions are given to Moses and Ezekiel in reference to the sprinkling of the blood, the burning of the ox, and the sacrificing of the chatat, the cleansing sacrifice. Chatat relates to the word sin, but also chatat here actually comes from another verbal meaning, which means to cleanse and purify. And there's even the word chata, the word chata and the word kapar both appear in both of these segments. However, there are some differences in Exodus and Leviticus. The focal point is this description of the dedication of the priest. Okay, this is why it actually starts with the idea of the dedication of the priest. And then here the ceremony is related to purifying the altar. I think the reason the purification of the altar is very central here is because Ezekiel relates to the whole idea of sin. So he's focusing on the altar and the details of the altar, and the ceremony has to be done on the altar and not on the dedication of the priest, because the focus here is returning to God, purifying the temple, rededicating the temple, bringing the temple back to its earlier stage where it was glorious, where it was clean, where it was acceptable and was good before God. And this is why we have this greater focus here. And we also have different animals here. In Exodus, we have 1 ox, 2 rams, and all the 7 days. Ezekiel actually has a ram only on the first day, and the rest of the days he actually has there's a ram on the first day for chatat, and then on the rest of the days the seir, the goat, is the chatat, and he just brings an ox and a ram as a burnt offering. The ending is also different because according to Leviticus 9:24, the 8th day was special because God decided to appear at the temple, at the tabernacle, by coming down with fire and eating the sacrifice. In Ezekiel, we don't have this description of fire coming down. We only have that it's basically a day like another day. You complete the ceremony, and that's it. What's also very interesting here is there's some details about the altar which are a little bit different than what we expect them to be. And these details, by the way, might have existed in the original altar as well. We just can't. There's no way of actually knowing. So he says to him, "Ve'ele midot hamizbach ba'amot, ama v'tofach." Okay, so he says to him, and this is the measurement of the altar in cubits. So a cubit is basically the distance from the elbow to the tip of the finger of an average man. So, for example, I'm actually a relatively large person, and so my cubit is longer than the average. But again, there were basically 5 different types of cubits. Cubits were divided up into fingers, fists, and then arms. And there was a small cubit of 5 fists, 6, and then the royal Egyptian cubit, which was 7. And he says that the measurements here are done by the measurements here are done by the 6 cubit measurement, because it says so a cubit and a fist, which means that there's a 5 and a 6 here. There's actually an interesting idea that there was a cubit used for construction, a cubit used for vessels. But this is basically a repeat of what we have earlier in the chapter 40, verse 5. He uses the same measurement. And he says v'chek ha'ama v'ama rochav. So he says the chek is an ama. So the chek seems to be the base. A chek is the interior, maybe what's produced when you hug someone. There's different opinions about what exactly it means, but this seems to be a base. It's a cubit high and then goes in 1 cubit. And it has a border, and this border seems to be like some kind of a ditch or a channel or some kind of grove in the altar itself, on the rim, and it's all around. Saviv zeret ha'echad. So it's 1 zeret. A zeret seems to be the distance between a person's thumb and small finger or pinky. That seems to be the size of it. So usually that actually will be pretty big because it's almost the size of half a cubit. They assume a cubit is about 46 to 52 centimeters, whatever that is in inches. This should be about 20 centimeters. So it's almost half a cubit. It says v'zeh gava mizbach. This is the back of the altar. This is basically the base. U'michek ha'aretz ad ha'azara tachtona 2 amot v'rochav ama achat. So from the base of the earth all the way to the lower azara. The term azara here is being used very unusually, but in a very unusual manner. But the term azara here basically refers to the boxes themselves. It's supposed to be 2 cubits. So we have 1 cubit, 2 cubits, okay, of the lower part. And then it goes in, ve'rochav amach, and it goes in 1 cubit. So again, another 46, 48 to 52 centimeters. U'ma'azara ktana Ad ha'azara ha'gedola, 4 amot ve'rochav ha'aman. From the smaller segment, the section to the larger section, 4 cubits, and then we go 1, 2, now 4. This is the third section, and it goes in ve'rochav. The width of it is 1 cubit that goes in 1 cubit. Ve'ha'ar'el 4 amot. The top part called the har'el, and there's a bit of a question what exactly this term har'el here means. Some people think it might relate to the idea to the Arabic root ari, which has an old Arabic root which has to do with burning, with an extra lamed at the end, like the word karmel, because it comes from the word kerem, which is a vineyard or an orchard, grove. So be careful, grove and groove. So excuse me if I got some of these words mixed up. But this is a lamed ending. It's a specific type of suffix, and this actually might be an area of either it relates to the idea of the burning area, or maybe the area of strength. Maybe it has to do with because the word ariel relates to strength as well. Maybe the place where animals are slaughtered. Not very clear. And then he says me'ariel umala hakarnot arba. From this ariel, from this top part upwards, 4 horns. Now, karnot, have to be very careful. Some of the very old drawings used to make actual horns. Today, what we see a lot, for example, from the Temple Institute and so on, are square horns. If you actually look at ancient altars, and we have examples of them from the land of Israel, it's like a horn, but it's very small. So you have a 90-degree part that sticks from the side, but then the interior part that faces the center of the altar is actually rounded. So it does look a little bit like a horn. And this is what they used to make. It wasn't a brick like we see in a lot of the Second Temple drawings. It was actually smoothed out on the inner side to create a bit of a half circle there. It actually does look like an altar, like a horn. It says va'ariel, so har'el, ariel, a bit of a game, but it's the same word. And the yared 12 orech ve-12 rochav, so it's 12 cubits by 12 cubits. Okay. 12, 12, 12, 12, basically across. It's supposed to be ravu el arba reva'av. It's supposed to be squared out to all its 4 sides. It's a perfect square. Verse 17. Va'azara 14 orech ba-14 rochav. The bottom part, the azara, beneath it, is 14 by 14. Okay? 14 orech, 14 length, 14 width. Al arba revaya, on its 4 sides, which is a perfect square. V'agvul saviv ota chatzi ha'ama, and it has a gvul. Now the gvul here seems to be again some kind of a ditch or a groove inside the shape of the altar itself, where you actually are supposed to pour blood. It looks as if it's like a blood collecting kind of area. And it's supposed to be chatzi ha'ama, half a cubit. Now, this actually might interpret the idea that the zeret mentioned earlier in verse 13 is chatzi ha'ama. As I said, it's approximately half a cubit. Here, I think maybe actually clarifying it actually really is half a cubit. Va'chekla amasavi, and it has the chek, which is the bottom part, what's underneath it, which is really supposed to be I think he skips a stage here because we have the arel, we have the azara, and then he has the gvul, and he skips the bottom azara. Interesting. Maybe we have to do a calculation that it's supposed to be 12, 14, 16, and then the bottom part is supposed to be 18. This is v'achek lahama saviv ma'aloteo penot kadim, and the chek, the bottom part, which is connected to the ground, is an amasaviv. Now, it's also quite possible, by the way, so it's 1 cubit all around. Now, the most intriguing part of this altar, by the way, is the last 3 words, Uma'alotehu penot kadim. A lot of people interpreted this as being stairs. The problem is the full ma'alotehu can be also in the singular, the stair, which means this actually could be a ramp. Now, the Torah forbids going up the altar with stairs. Lo ta'alev ma'alot al mizbechi. Okay, you will not go up the altar with stairs, so you don't expose yourself when you go up there. You go up on a ramp, which requires you to walk smaller steps, less exposure of the body. And what's interesting here is it's ma'aloteo. If I'm not mistaken, the Septuagint actually translates as a plural, but the chances are this is actually, in a singular, it might be a ramp. But what's even more important is the ramp turns to the east. If you look at drawings of the Second Temple, it always faces south. But really, here it's giving us a very specific location. It's supposed to be on the east and the other end. So when a priest goes up to the altar, he goes up the altar, he stands on the altar, and he's actually facing the temple. And this is probably how it was done in the tabernacle. The priest will do the service facing the temple, facing God's presence, and not coming up from the south, and some have to stand, go up and then turn towards it, which is very, very awkward. It's quite possible the reason they did this in the second temple was because the altar was so large that there was really no place to put it on the east, because it would just take up all the area, and the space of the altar would penetrate other areas which were designated for everyone else. So they moved it to the south, and then the north wasn't an option, because north is where they slaughtered the animals. That was a traditional place. Because they made the altar so big, they just had to move the ramp to a different area, because you have to have a ramp that's equal. There has to be a calculation here of how steep a ramp can be, and the length of the ramp was so big that it would just penetrate the area of the Levites and the priestly area, the Levitical area, and probably even part into the little area it was given for Israel in the temple. Even though those divisions I have a lot to say about that, but that might be something for another time. So it's very interesting. He has either a ramp. I'm very doubtful if these were stairs, and again, Ma'alotehu is a very morphologically a very strange form, but not too terrible, and it faces the east, which is a big change from what we usually see in drawings of the second temple. And then we actually go into the sacrifice themselves. Verse 18. He said to me, "Son of man, Ko amar Adonai Elohim, thus says the Lord God, Ele chukot hamizbeach beyom ha'asoto." These are laws of the altar when it is made, when basically you're ready to use it. La'alot alav olah, to bring upon it a burnt offering. V'lizrok alav dam, to throw upon it blood, which are the most basic things to do with an altar. And he says, "V'natatai la'kohanim haleviim," give to the Levite priests. And the reason he emphasizes the Levite priests is because we actually, during the end of the first temple, there were people who came from, mentioned in the stories of King Josiah and the Book of Kings, people who came from the north, who their families were designated as priests, but they were not really recognized as priests. Some of them might have been Levites, but some of them might just been regular people. It says Yerovam made priests from Miktzot Ha'am, from all the different parts of the people. He was basically being very plural about his service in the temple and so on. And these were people that their families always remembered. They were priests. But he's making a point. These are Levite priests. These people have to be from the house of Levi. But he specifies, Asher hem mizera tzadok akrovim elai, which are from the seed of Zadok, the seed of Tzadok, who are near to me, who are the ones I have chosen. Ne'um Adonai Elohim l'shareteni, the word of the Lord God to serve me. So he's making a point. Don't allow anyone else into this. Not anyone can jump on this wagon of saying, I'm a Zadok, I'm a Tzadok, and so on. There's a problem with this, by the way, today. There are certain sects which are developed who think that they're somehow from some priestly line or something. Very, very questionable things. And he says to them, Par ben bakar lechatat, an ox, son of the herd. Ben bakar means son of the cattle, basically the family of the bovines, as a burnt off, as a cleansing offering, lechatat. And it says, "V'lakachta medamo." Here he speaks about in the first person. Now, some people read this saying that he's actually telling Ezekiel, "You're supposed to do this." You can also say this is a generalized observation, generalized way of describing it, and you will take from the blood. Any one of the priests can do this, and you will take from its blood. You will place it 4 horns, and that's still consistent with what we have in Exodus and Leviticus. But then he says, "Ve'el pinot ha'azara," into the 4 corners of the azara. Now, there are 2 ways of reading this. Either he's talking about the altar itself, meaning on the 4 sides of the walls of the altar, but some people have argued that maybe we're talking about the 4 corners of the temple itself. But contextually, the Azara relates to the idea of the altar itself, so this is probably, in the previous segment, so this is probably what it means, the altar itself. Ve'lagvul saviv, and to this groove that they have all around. Now, that actually might be the groove on the base of the altar, which still is consistent, but some people try to read this maybe being the groove on the top part of the altar. I actually want to argue maybe it's the bottom groove, because the top groove is supposed to collect any blood that goes down from the horns and the sides of the wall, and then you have to pour whatever's left on the base. That's actually pretty consistent with what we have in Exodus and Leviticus. But some people try to read this a little differently. It says, "V'chiteta oto v'chiparto," and you will cleanse it and you will atone for it. "V'lakachta et parach chatat," you will take the ox of cleansing. "U'srafo b'mifkad habayit michutz hamikdash." You will burn it at a place called Mifkad habayit. We're not really sure exactly where it is. It's maybe a guarded place, a designated place. We're not too sure. Outside of the temple. So this is pretty consistent still with Leviticus and Exodus. So Vayom HaSheni, on the second day, Takriv seir ezim tamim lechatat. Now you will sacrifice a hairy goat, unblemished, as a cleansing offering. Now we have the shift. V'chiteot hamizbach asher chiteu bapar, and they will cleanse the altar as they cleansed with the ox. Bechalotcha mechateh, when you complete the cleansing, Takriv par ben bakar tamim, you will offer, now this is probably daily, you will burn, or you will sacrifice, again, an oxen, son of the bovine, unblemished, ve'ayin min hatzon tamim, and a ram from the flock, unblemished as well. I'm adding the word as well. Ve'kravtam lifnei Adonai, and you will bring them forth before the Lord, or burn them before the Lord. Now suddenly the priests are involved. The priests will throw upon them salt. All sacrifices are supposed to be served with salt. And you will offer them up as a burnt offering to the Lord. 7 days you will do a hairy goat as a cleansing offering per day. And an ox of the bovine and a ram from the flock, unblemished they shall be done. 7 days they will atone for the altar, and they will purify it, and they will fill its hands. Now, milui, this is actually an archaic term. It's not that the altar has hands or something. Milui yad really means it literally meant to fill someone's hand with things that designate their service. Here the altar is being dedicated, and therefore milui yad is the term being used here for dedication. The same way a Kohen, when he's dedicated, his hands are filled by the fact that he has to hold the sacrifice and then put it on the altar. This is the idea of what you would call dedication by action, or learning through practice. So the dedication here is through the practice itself of doing the sacrifices. This is a preparation, something which we go back to the altar of Har Eval. I mentioned this, that they actually found a lower strata of that altar. They actually found this dedication stone that seems to be like what they did. They did it for several days, and then they built the altar on top. So this is the same thing. It says, Ve'chalu et hayamim, when they will complete the days. V'aya v'yom hashmini v'hal'an, will be on the 8th day and onwards. Not 8th day God appears. We actually don't have a description like this here, which is really interesting. This is, but on the 8th day and onwards, Yasu hakohanim al hamizbeach et orotechem et shalmechem, and the priest will do upon the altar your burnt offerings and your peace offerings. Ve'retzeti etchem, and I will atone for you. I will accept you. Ne'um Adonai Elohim, the word of the Lord God, and that's really what the focus is. That God will accept and will be atoned. And that's really why Ezekiel focuses so much about the altar here and the service of the altar, because that's really the point. But as I said earlier, to have a temple is to have God's presence with us. And to have God's presence with us is a privilege. And that requires us to know His Torah and follow His Torah and fulfill the Torah by keeping it. So maybe we see this in our days as well. I want to thank you for joining me again. If this recording has been of interest to you, please share it with your friends and family. And I want to wish you a wonderful week. And as I said, may we see this in our days.